They laughed, while my grandson's blanket was still in his mother's hands. The room was bright, full of soft music and the quiet clinking of champagne glasses, the kind of sound that tells you everything is supposed to be perfect, and I stood there holding what had taken me 9 months to make while my daughter glanced, not at me, but at her mother-in-law. Just a quick look, barely a second, but long enough for me to understand that whatever happened next wasn't really up to her anymore. And then she said, with a small, tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "Mom, we registered for specific things," and before I could answer, before I could even finish the breath I had taken to explain, her husband stepped forward, took the quilt from her hands, and dropped it onto the gift table like it was something he didn't want to hold for too long, like it might stain him, and he laughed softly, not loud, not cruel in the way people imagine cruelty, but controlled, practiced, the kind that invites others to join in without making it obvious, and someone did, and then someone else, and suddenly the room felt smaller, tighter, like the air had shifted just enough to remind me I didn't belong in it, and I noticed details I hadn't before, the polished wood of the table, the white wicker chair my daughter was sitting in, the way the quilt lay there half-folded, one corner slipping toward the floor, and I thought about the nights I had spent at my kitchen table, measuring, cutting, stitching each square together after long shifts, my hands aching, the clock ticking past midnight, and I heard my daughter again, softer this time, almost like she was trying to fix something that had already been broken. "It's just not really our style," and I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I understood something much more important in that moment, something I had learned a long time ago, that there are moments when speaking doesn't give you power, it takes it away. So I said nothing. I stepped forward, reached past the tissue paper and the neatly wrapped boxes from people who knew exactly what brand names mattered, and I picked up the quilt, carefully, the way you pick up something that still means something even if no one else can see it, and I folded it slowly, smoothing each edge with my hands, not rushing, not looking at anyone, because I could feel their eyes on me now, waiting, maybe expecting a reaction, an apology, an explanation, something that would make them more comfortable, but I didn't give them that. I just folded it the way I had folded it the first time, when it was finished, when it still felt like a gift, and as I did, I heard someone behind me whisper, "Is it homemade?" and another voice answer, "I think so," like it was a question about quality, not about time, not about care, not about love, and I placed the quilt over my arm, held it there for a second, and looked at my daughter. Really looked at her, at the way she avoided my eyes, at the way her fingers adjusted the ribbon on another gift instead, and that was when I knew, not everything, not yet, but enough to understand that this moment wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something else entirely, and I turned, still silent, and walked out of the room while the music kept playing and the laughter slowly found something new to hold on to. I walked past rows of parked cars that cost more than everything I had owned at 30, heels clicking against the pavement, the sound steady, controlled, the same way my breathing was, and I did not look back because I already knew what I would see if I did. A room that had closed itself around a version of my daughter that no longer needed me, and that was not new, not really. It had started long before today, just quieter, slower, easier to ignore until it was not, and when I reached my car, I placed the quilt on the passenger seat with both hands, smoothing it once, the way I used to smooth her hair when she was little and could not sleep, and I sat there without starting the engine, without moving, just listening to the faint music drifting from the building behind me, and I said it out loud, not loud, just enough to hear it myself, all right, because sometimes you need to hear your own voice to understand that something has shifted, and I did not cry. I had learned that too, years ago. That tears take energy, and energy is something you save for decisions, not reactions. So I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and scrolled past her name without stopping, because calling her now would change nothing. And I knew that with a clarity that surprised even me, and instead I opened something else, an email thread I had not looked at in months. Subject line simple, 3 words, venue lease agreement, and I read the last message. Again, the one confirming the extension, the one with the signature at the bottom that nobody in that room would have recognized if they saw it on paper, and I closed the phone, set it down, and started the car, the engine turning over smooth and quiet, like it always had, and as I pulled out of the lot, I passed the service entrance, the one I had used earlier because it was easier, because I did not need the front doors to make an entrance. I had never needed that, and the memory came back. Without asking, the first time my daughter had hesitated before introducing me to someone from his family, the way she had said my name just a little too quickly, like she was trying to move past it. This is my mom, Laura. No details, no stories. No mention of the years, the work, the life that had built everything she now stood inside, and I had let it go then, just like I had let go of the missed calls, the shorter visits, the holidays that shifted from my table to someone else's. Small things, each one easy to excuse on its own, and I drove for 20 minutes before I turned onto my street, the same street I had lived on for 28 years, same trees, same cracked sidewalk in front of Mrs. Donnelly's house, same porch light I had replaced myself last winter, and when I walked inside, the quiet met me the way it always did, familiar, steady, honest, and I hung my coat, set my bag on the kitchen table, and placed the quilt in the center, unfolding it this time, letting it spread out completely, every square visible, every stitch exactly where I had put it, and I ran my hand over one corner, the blue fabric from her first winter coat, and then another, the pale yellow from a dress she had worn to a school play, and then I stopped at the last square, the one no one had asked about, the one no one had noticed, and I pressed my fingers against it for a second longer than the rest. And I said quietly, not yet, because whatever they thought they had seen today, whatever they believed about me, about what I was worth, about what I could give or take away, they were working with a version of the story that was incomplete, and I had spent my entire life understanding one thing better than most people ever do, that timing is not about speed, it is about control, and I had just been given all the time I needed. He did not rush me out of the office, and I did not rush to leave, because moments like that are not about speed, they're about alignment, and I watched as he reopened the folder, this time slower, more deliberate, flipping through pages that most people would not understand even if they read them twice, clauses, dates, signatures, numbers that looked ordinary until you knew where to look, and he tapped one section lightly with his pen. This clause here, he said. Renewal terms tied to discretionary approval, and I nodded once because I remembered that clause very clearly. I had insisted on it years ago when the agreement was first drafted, back when the property was still just a piece of land with more potential than value. And he continued, they assumed automatic continuation, and I allowed myself the smallest pause before responding. They assumed a lot of things, and that was the truth. Assumptions are comfortable. They let people build lives on foundations they never bothered to check, and I had never been that kind of person. Not when I was younger, not when I had nothing, and certainly not now. And he turned another page, scanning financial summaries, event bookings, projected revenue streams. And he let out a quiet breath. Not surprise, not exactly, more like confirmation. They are doing very well with it, he said, and I looked at the numbers, not impressed, not offended, just observing, because numbers do not lie. But they also do not tell the whole story unless you know what to ask, and I said, of course they are, because the location was strong, the structure solid, and the timing had been right. All things I had accounted for long before they ever stepped into it, and he closed the folder again, this time with intention, and leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering just enough to signal that we had moved past review and into strategy. If you want to make changes, he said, you can, but it will not be subtle, and I met his gaze, steady, unflinching. I am not interested in subtle, I said, and that was the first time something shifted in his expression, not concern, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are no longer advising, they are executing. And he nodded once, then we need to be precise, and I agreed, because precision is what separates reaction from action, and he reached for a notepad, beginning to outline steps, timelines, legal notices, the mechanics of control that most people never see. Until it is too late, and as he spoke, my mind moved somewhere else for a moment, not away, but backward, to a time when none of this existed, when I was standing in a different kind of office, smaller, worn, across from a man who had looked at me over a stack of papers and said, "You are taking a risk," and I had said, "I know," because that was all I had ever done, taken risks quietly, without announcement, without audience. And that first property had not been impressive, not to anyone else. But it had been enough to start, enough to learn, enough to build something that did not rely on anyone's approval. And I came back to the present as he finished outlining the final step. "Once we initiate this," he said, "they will be notified within 48 hours, and I considered that for a second, not the timing itself, but what it would mean, the shift it would create, the questions it would raise, and I asked, and until then, and he gave a small, controlled smile, until then. Everything continues as if nothing has changed, and I nodded, because that was exactly how I preferred it. No noise, no warning, just movement beneath the surface, and I stood, gathering the folder, placing it back into my bag with the same care I had used the night before, and as I moved toward the door, he said, "Laura," and I paused, turning just enough to acknowledge him. "Are you sure about this?" And I held his gaze for a moment, not defensive, not emotional, just clear. "I have been sure for a long time," I said. "I just did not need to act until now." And with that, I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, the same quiet order, the same measured pace, except now everything had a direction, and for the first time since I walked out of that room the day before, I allowed myself a single thought, simple, precise, and final. They had mistaken silence for absence, and that was never what it meant. The drive home felt shorter than it should have, not because the distance had changed, but because my mind was already several steps ahead, moving through possibilities the way it always had, quietly, methodically, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I was no longer thinking about what had happened. I was thinking about what they believed had happened, and that difference mattered more than anything else, because perception is where most people stop, and I had built my life in the space beyond it. And when I stepped inside, the house greeted me the same way it always did, still, grounded, untouched by anyone else's assumptions, and I set my bag down, removed my coat, and walked straight to the small cabinet near the hallway. The one most people would overlook, because it did not look like anything important, just wood, simple, functional, but inside it held records that went back decades, neatly organized, labeled, not for display, not for conversation, but for moments exactly. Like this, and I opened it, pulled out a thin folder I had not needed in years, and placed it on the kitchen table beside the quilt, the two things sitting there together like parts of the same story that no one else had bothered to read, and I opened the folder, flipping through pages that had once been decisions, risks, nights of doubt, and now were simply facts, and I stopped on a document that carried a date from years ago, long before my daughter had met her husband, long before that family had ever stepped into my life, and I remembered the day I signed it, the way the pen had felt in my hand, steady, certain, even when the man across from me had said, "You could lose everything if this does not work." And I had looked at him and replied, "Then I will know I tried," because that was always the difference. I had never waited for permission to build something. I had just done it, quietly, without asking anyone to understand, and I closed the folder. Slowly, placing my hand flat against it for a moment, grounding myself in the reality of what I had created, and then my phone rang, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was, but I did anyway. Just to confirm, and there it was, her name, and I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because timing matters even in conversation, and when I picked up, I did not speak first, I let her fill the silence, and she did, quickly, her voice tight, controlled, "Mom, you left," and I leaned slightly against the table, my eyes resting on the quilt. "Yes," I said, simple, neutral, and there was a pause on the other end, not long, but enough to reveal something beneath her words, something unsettled, and then she continued, "You did not say anything," and I allowed the smallest breath before responding, "No, I did not," and another pause, longer this time, and I could almost see her. Standing somewhere quieter now, away from the room, away from the noise, trying to make sense of something she had not expected, and she said, softer, "They did not mean it like that," and I closed my eyes for just a second, not in frustration, not in hurt, but in recognition, because I had heard that sentence before, in different forms, at different times, always serving the same purpose, to soften something that had already landed exactly as intended, and I opened my eyes again, looking down at the fabric beneath my hand. "It does not matter how they meant it," I said, my voice steady. "It matters what they did," and she did not answer right away, and in that silence I understood something else, something important, that she was not calling to apologize, she was calling to manage, to adjust, to keep everything aligned with the version of her life she had chosen, and I did not interrupt that process. I let it play out. Because sometimes the truth reveals itself best when you do nothing at all, and finally she said, "Can we talk later?" And I nodded even though she could not see it. "Of course," I said, and when the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table, next to the folder, next to the quilt, and I stood there for a moment longer, not thinking about what she had said, but about what she had not said, and that was enough, more than enough, because clarity does not always come from words. Sometimes it comes from their absence, and I had everything I needed now, not just the documents, not just the control, but the understanding, and that was what made the next step inevitable. The house was quiet again after the call ended, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not empty, not waiting, but settled, like something had finally taken its place. And I stood there for a moment longer before pulling the chair out and sitting down at the table, the folder still open, the quilt still spread beneath my hands, and I looked again at that last square, the one no one had noticed, the one stitched in with the same care as the rest, but holding something entirely different, and I slid my fingers underneath the edge of it, lifting it slightly, revealing what it concealed, not fabric, not memory, but a thin seam, deliberate, precise, and I opened it carefully, the way I had done only once before, when I first placed it there. And inside was a small, folded document, protected, untouched, exactly where I had left it, and I took it out, unfolding it slowly, the paper crisp, the ink still sharp, and I read the first line again, not because I needed to, but because I respected what it represented, ownership, not just of property, but of decisions, of timing, of control, and I remembered the day I decided to place it there, months ago, long before any of this had happened, when my daughter first told me about the venue they had chosen. The excitement in her voice, the way she described the place as if it had appeared just for her, and I had listened, quietly, asking simple questions, dates, names, arrangements, and when she mentioned the lease, the long-term agreement, I had said nothing. Not because I did not recognize it, but because I did, and that recognition had been enough, and later that night, I had taken this document, the one tied directly to that property, the one that could change everything if it needed to, and I had stitched it into the quilt, not as a trick, not as a plan, but as a reminder to myself that everything I had built still belonged to me, no matter who stood in the room, no matter who believed otherwise, and I folded the paper again now, placing it back into the seam, closing it carefully, pressing it flat so that it disappeared once more into the pattern, invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look, and I leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly, letting the pieces settle into place, because this was never about one moment, not about one comment, not about one room full of people who had decided what I was worth based on what they could see. It was about something larger, something that had been building quietly over time. The distance, the assumptions, the shift in how I was seen, and more importantly, how I was no longer seen, and my phone buzzed again, this time not a call, just a message, and I picked it up, glancing at the screen, a name I recognized, one of the event coordinators tied to the property, someone who had always been professional, always precise, and the message was simple, just confirming next month's booking schedule. Everything is moving forward as planned, and I stared at the words for a second. Not because I needed to read them twice, but because I understood what they represented, normalcy, continuation, the illusion that nothing had shifted, and I typed back just 2 words, for now, before setting the phone down again. And I stood, gathering the quilt in my hands, folding it once more, slower this time, more deliberate, aligning each edge perfectly, because there is something important about finishing what you start, even when no one else understands it. And as I carried it down the hallway toward the small closet where I kept things that mattered, I paused at the doorway, looking back at the table, at the folder, at the space where everything had just changed without a single raised voice. And I said quietly, not to anyone else, but to the moment itself, they had their turn, because that was the truth of it. They had their moment, their laughter, their assumptions, their version of the story, and now, without noise, without warning, the balance had begun to shift, and I closed the closet door gently, leaving the quilt inside, exactly where it needed to be, waiting. 48 hours is a very precise amount of time when you know exactly what is going to happen at the end of it, and I did not spend those hours waiting. I spent them watching, not in a way anyone would notice, not calling, not asking questions, but observing the way things continued as if nothing had shifted, and that told me everything I needed to know, because people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe everything is still under control, and by the second afternoon my phone rang again, this time earlier in the day, and when I looked at the screen I saw my daughter's name, and I let it ring once before answering, not to delay, but to maintain the same rhythm I had set, and when I picked up, her voice came quickly. A little sharper than before. Mom, something strange just happened, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, looking out the window at the quiet street. What happened? I asked, calm, steady, and she exhaled softly, like she was trying to keep her thoughts organized. The venue manager just called. They said there might be an issue with the contract, something about a review, and they could not give me details, and I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not because I was surprised, but because I recognized the exact point where confusion begins, where certainty starts to fracture, and I said, evenly, that sounds like something they should be able to explain to you. And there was a pause, longer this time, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted, less certain. They said the property owner requested it, and I let that sit for a second before responding. Then you should speak to the property owner. And another pause, heavier now, because something in that sentence had landed differently than the others. Something that did not fit into the version of reality she had been working with, and she said, quieter, we do not actually know who that is, and I stood slowly, walking toward the kitchen, each step measured, deliberate, because moments like this are not rushed. They're allowed to unfold, and I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the counter. That is important information to have, I said, and I could hear the tension now, not dramatic, not loud, but present, building in the space between us, and she said, almost defensively, that is not how these things usually work, and I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it. No, I said, it is not, and that was the truth. Most people never think about ownership beyond the surface, beyond the name on the invitation, beyond the person handing them a contract. And she was quiet again, and when she spoke, her voice was softer, searching. Mom, do you know anything about this? And I did not answer right away, not because I was avoiding the question, but because I understood the weight of the answer, and I chose my words carefully, the same way I had chosen my silence before. I know how these situations work, I said, and I let that be enough for the moment, because clarity, when it comes too fast, can be dismissed, but when it builds slowly, it cannot be ignored, and she inhaled quietly on the other end, and I could hear it now, the shift, not complete, not yet, but beginning. The realization that something existed beyond what she had been told, beyond what she had assumed, and she said, almost to herself, I will have him look into it, and I knew exactly who she meant, and I said nothing, because there was nothing left to guide. Nothing left to soften. This was where understanding had to come from her, not from me, and when the call ended, I set the phone down gently, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with certainty, because everything was moving exactly as it needed to, not fast, not slow, just precise, and I walked back to the hallway, stopping briefly at the closed closet door, my hand resting against it for a second, feeling the stillness behind it. The quiet presence of something that no longer needed to be explained, and I said softly, "Now they will start asking the right questions, because that is always where it begins, not with answers, but with the moment someone realizes they have been standing in the middle of something they never truly understood, and by then, it is already too late to go back." The next call did not come from my daughter, and that was how I knew things had moved beyond confusion and into urgency, because when people stop asking softly, they start reaching outward, and this time the name on my phone was unfamiliar to most, but not to me. And I answered on the second ring, not rushed, not delayed, just exactly when I intended to, and a man's voice came through, controlled, but strained in a way he was trying to hide. "Mrs. Bennet," he said, "this is Daniel Ashford. We have not formally met, but I believe we need to speak," and I walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the same quiet street that had not changed in decades. "Yes," I said, "I believe we do," and there was a brief pause. The kind that happens when someone recalibrates mid-conversation, and then he continued, "There seems to be some confusion regarding the property agreement tied to our event operations." And I let the word confusion sit there for a second before responding, "Is there?" And I could almost hear him adjust his posture on the other end, shifting from assumption to caution. "We were informed that a review has been initiated, and certain terms may not be as fixed as we were led to believe," and I nodded slightly. Even though he could not see it, because that was an accurate way of describing it. "That is correct," I said, and another pause followed, longer now, heavier, because confirmation removes the comfort of doubt, and he spoke again, more direct this time. "Mrs. Bennet, we have invested significant resources into this venue, long-term projections, scheduled bookings, reputational commitments, and any disruption could have serious consequences," and I rested my hand lightly against the glass, feeling the cool surface under my fingertips. "I understand," I said, calmly, and I did. I understood exactly how much they stood to lose, because I had calculated it long before they ever considered the possibility, and he continued, the control in his voice tightening just enough to reveal pressure beneath it. "We were under the impression that the agreement was secure, that all necessary approvals had been finalized," and I allowed a small breath before answering. "You were under that impression," I said, and there it was again, that shift, subtle but undeniable. The moment where certainty cracks and something less comfortable begins to take its place, and he said, more carefully now, "Are you saying that is not the case?" And I turned slightly, looking back into the room. At the table where everything had been laid out just days before, "I am saying that agreements are only as secure as the conditions that support them," I replied, my voice even, measured, and I let that statement stand on its own, because explanations are often unnecessary when the truth is structured clearly enough, and he did not speak immediately. And in that silence I could hear the realization forming, not complete, not yet, but unavoidable, and when he finally spoke again, his tone had changed, less assertive, more precise. "What would you like from us?" And I closed my eyes briefly, not out of fatigue, but out of recognition, because that question is always the turning point, the moment where control shifts fully from one side to the other, and I opened them again, looking out at the stillness beyond the glass. "This is not about what I want," I said. "It is about what is appropriate," and I could almost feel the tension in that word settle on the other end of the line, and he exhaled quietly. "Then help me understand what appropriate looks like in this situation," and I allowed a small pause before answering, not to create drama, but to ensure clarity. "Appropriate looks like a full review of all terms, immediate compliance with any outstanding conditions, and a willingness to operate within the boundaries that were originally agreed upon," and I stopped there, because anything more would have been unnecessary, and he responded after a moment, his voice steady again, but different now. "We will cooperate fully," and I nodded once. "I am sure you will," I said, and as the call ended, I set the phone down carefully, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with a quiet certainty that everything had shifted exactly as it needed to, because what they had just experienced was not a threat, Not a confrontation, but something far more difficult to navigate, a reality they could not ignore, and as I stood there in the stillness of the room, I understood one thing with complete clarity. They were no longer reacting to an event. They were responding to me, and that difference changes everything. The final call came just before sunset, the light in the room turning softer, stretching across the floor in long quiet lines, and I was already standing near the kitchen when the phone rang, not surprised, not waiting, just aware that this was how it would end. Not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more difficult to ignore, and when I looked at the screen and saw my daughter's name again, I answered on the first ring this time, because some moments do not require distance, they require presence, and for a second neither of us spoke, just the sound of breathing on the line, and then she said, quietly, Mom. I know, and I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of relief, but out of recognition, because those two words carry more weight than any explanation ever could, and I asked, simply, what do you know? And she hesitated. Just long enough to gather what she had pieced together, the venue, the contract. They said your name, and I let the silence hold for a second before responding, yes, and I could hear something shift in her then, not anger, not even shock, but something deeper. Something closer to understanding, and she said, her voice softer now, stripped of the certainty it once carried, why didn't you tell me? And I leaned lightly against the counter, my hand resting where it had been so many times before, steady. Familiar, you never asked, I said, and that was not meant to hurt, not meant to accuse, just the truth, plain and unadorned, and she let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for longer than just this conversation. I did not think. She started, and then stopped, and I finished it for her, not harshly, not gently, just accurately. You did not think it mattered, and the silence that followed was different from the others, not tense, not uncertain, but full, like something had finally settled into place, and after a moment she said, almost to herself, he said it was just a formality, that everything was handled, and I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it, because that is how these things are often presented, simple, clean, already decided, and I said, people tend to believe what benefits them, and she did not argue, did not defend, and that was when I knew she had crossed the point where explanation was no longer necessary, and she asked, quietly, what happens now? And I considered that question carefully, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood what she was really asking, not about contracts, not about property, but about us. About what remained after everything else had shifted, and I said, now everything is clear, and I let that settle before continuing. The terms will be followed, the agreements will be honored properly, and everyone will understand exactly where they stand. And she was quiet again, and then she said, with a kind of honesty I had not heard from her in a long time, I should have stood up for you, and I did not respond right away, not because I did not hear her, but because I wanted her to hear herself. To sit with that realization without interruption, and after a moment I said, you should have understood me, and that was the difference, not defense, not loyalty in a moment, but understanding over time, and she inhaled slowly, and I could almost see her, standing somewhere unfamiliar, looking at everything she thought she knew and seeing it differently for the first time, and she said, I am sorry, and I believed her, not because of the words, but because of the way they came. Unguarded, unstructured, real, and I nodded once, even though she could not see it. I know, I said, and we stood there in that quiet connection for a moment longer, neither of us rushing to fill it, because some silences are not empty, they are necessary. And when the call ended, I set the phone down gently and walked to the hallway, opening the closet door and taking the quilt out once more, holding it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, not just the fabric, but everything it carried. Everything it had seen, and I folded it carefully, the same way I had before, the same way I always would, because some things do not change, no matter who forgets their value, and as I placed it back on the shelf, I understood something with complete clarity. Something I had known for years, but had never needed to say out loud, that respect is not something you ask for, and it is not something you force, it is something people either recognize or lose access to, and I closed the door softly, leaving the house exactly as it had always been, quiet, steady, and entirely mine.